Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we are going to be looking at some pretty wild ideas about human sexuality.
Sounds fun.
Yeah,
Oh,
we're going to be pulling out excerpts from Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan and Casilda Jeffa,
okay.
and we're going to challenge some of those assumptions we have about, monogamy and the nuclear family and all that.
Yeah, looking forward to this.
Should be fun. So you ready to maybe have your mind blown wide open a little bit?
Always.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's get into it. So, one of the things that's interesting about this topic is how often we just accept, the standard story,
Mm.
about, how human mating evolved
Right.
without ever stopping to, is that even true?
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's so fascinating about this book is that it challenges that traditional story, right? The one we hear all the time, that men are kind of programmed to be concerned about paternity certainty because, it's all about passing on their genes.
Okay.
And women are more focused on securing resources and stability for raising kids. And therefore, ta-da, monogamy. Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, well, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But Sex at Dawn really kind of takes a sledgehammer to that narrative.
Yeah.
And Ryan and Jetha really argue that this traditional story, it's based on, a lot of flawed assumptions and kind of like a very culturally biased reading of the evidence.
Mm. It's interesting, right? So they lay it out that Sex at Dawn suggests that early humans were probably living in societies where sharing was just like the norm.
Like sharing everything.
Sharing everything.
Oh, wow.
And here's the kicker, including sexual partners.
Okay. Yeah, that does kind of blow apart a lot of our modern assumptions.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm.
Now, obviously our first reaction might be like, whoa,
Yeah.
that's a little out there.
Yeah.
But the authors make a pretty compelling case.
Yeah.
They look at evidence from our nearest primate relative,
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
chimpanzees and bonobos,
Okay.
and they point out that both of these species are highly promiscuous.
Mm-hmm.
The females mate with multiple males.
I see. So are they saying that we should be more like chimps and bonobos?
Well, I mean, they're not saying we should be swinging from the trees or anything,
Okay, but
they argue that these primate parallels give us a little window into potentially our own evolutionary history.
so it's like looking at them to see what we might have been like.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, if they're doing it and they're our closest relatives, maybe
Yeah, that makes sense.
maybe that says something about us.
Yeah.
And the thing that's interesting to me is that bonobos in particular use sex to diffuse conflict
Really?
and maintain social harmony within their groups.
Huh. So it's like a way of keeping the peace.
It's like their version of shaking hands or,
So interesting.
hugging it out or whatever.
Yeah, instead of fighting over things, they
Exactly.
just,
They just have sex.
have a little fun.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they're saying that, maybe early humans had similar mating patterns.
Okay, so it's not just primates. The book also talks about clues from our own bodies, right?
Build the tea.
Okay. All right. So one thing is the size difference between men and women. It's actually pretty small compared to other primates, especially those where males really compete intensely for mates. If you think about gorillas, the silverback male is massive
Yeah.
compared to the females.
Yeah.
Right. But in humans, the size difference is much less. So that might suggest that maybe our ancestors weren't as engaged in that kind of intense competition for mates.
Interesting. So maybe those cavemans,
Yeah.
battling it out over a woman.
Yeah.
Maybe not so accurate.
Not quite. And another clue is actually human penis size.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's relatively large compared to other primates, especially those where females mostly mate with one male.
Hmm.
And this points to a past that might have involved something called sperm competition.
Burn competition.
So that basically means that when females have multiple partners, the sperm from each guy are all kind of racing to fertilize the egg.
It's like a microscopic battle.
It really is. Like millions of tiny swimmers all trying to reach the same goal.
That's a pretty vivid image.
Yep.
Okay, so we've got primate parallels. We've got these anatomical clues that maybe point toward a more promiscuous past. But are there any actual societies out there, that have these kind of non-monogamous setups?
Yeah, there totally are. The book talks about this concept called partible paternity.
Partible paternity, what is that?
So it's the belief that a child can actually have multiple fathers.
Well, hold on. Multiple dads.
Yeah, and this isn't like some fringe idea.
Right.
It's actually found in various cultures around the world.
So, there are cultures out there where having multiple dads is totally normal.
Yeah, totally.
Wow. Okay, give me some examples.
Okay, so for example, the Ashe people in Paraguay
Okay.
and the Lusi in Papua New Guinea.
Right.
In these societies, partible paternity actually increases a child's chance of survival
Really?
because they have care from multiple men.
So it's like more dads equals more resource.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like a built-in support system.
Mhm.
And it also reduces conflict between men because there's less competition for like sole ownership of a child.
I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah,
Like from a survival perspective,
totally.
more people to help raise a child.
Right, right.
Yeah. But how does that play out, like in terms of family dynamics?
Yeah, so Sex at Dawn also talks about the Mosuo people of China. They're really fascinating. They're a matriarchal society where women have a lot of sexual autonomy
Mm.
and children are raised communally.
So they're like a real life example of a culture that breaks the mold of that traditional nuclear family.
Exactly. Yeah, they really challenge our assumptions about what family structures can look like.
Okay, so if monogamy and the nuclear family weren't necessarily the norm throughout human history, what changed things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's where the agricultural revolution comes in.
Yeah.
This was a massive turning point for human societies about 10,000 years ago.
Okay.
With agriculture came the idea of private property and inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly men became a lot more invested in knowing exactly who their biological children were.
To pass down the land.
Exactly,
Yeah.
to make sure their land and possessions went to the right people.
Interesting. So you're saying that agriculture might have been good for building wealth and stuff, but
Yeah,
maybe not so great for our,
for our love life.
for our love lives.
Yeah, Sex at Dawn argues that this shift towards private property and paternity certainty might have led to the suppression of our naturally more fluid and flexible approach to sexual relationships.
So basically, like, the way that we organize our societies, especially around things like ownership, could have actually changed our sexual behavior.
Mm-hmm. Potentially.
That's a pretty crazy thought.
It is. It makes you think, huh?
Yeah, for sure. It makes you think about how we view relationships and family structures today.
Totally.
And like, it's fascinating to think about,
Yeah.
but wouldn't that make people like insanely jealous?
Yeah. I mean, jealousy is such a powerful emotion.
Right.
If our ancestors were just casually sharing partners, like, wouldn't that have been a recipe for constant drama?
Seems like it, right?
Yeah, for sure. Sex at Dawn tackles that question of jealousy head on. And they suggest that maybe it's not as hardwired into us as we think.
Wait, hold on. Are they saying that like all jealousy is just cultural?
Well, they're not saying it's all cultural, but they argue that it might be more of a learned response
Oh.
shaped by societal expectations and norms rather than like a purely biological drive.
So maybe instead of being born with like a jealousy meter,
Yeah,
we actually learn those feelings based on the culture that we grow up on.
exactly. That's what they're proposing.
Okay, so now we're questioning monogamy.
Mm.
We're rethinking jealousy.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what about like those times when even like the most committed partners find themselves, getting a little distracted? Is there an evolutionary explanation for that too?
Well, Sex at Dawn actually talks about something called the Coolidge effect.
The Coolidge effect.
Yeah, have you heard of this?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so it's this phenomenon where males across many different species actually show like renewed sexual interest when they encounter a new
Yeah.
female.
Even if they're already like
Yeah.
in a relationship.
Exactly. Even if they're already in a satisfying relationship.
So you're telling me like even if you're happy with your partner,
Yeah.
your biology is like, ooh, check out the new model.
It's like there's this tension between our ingrained tendencies
Uh-huh.
and like the rules we've built around monogamy.
So are we like doomed to always be fighting against our biology?
Well, that's a good question.
Are there any cultures that have figured out how to make this whole like non-monogamy thing actually work?
Yeah, Sex at Dawn actually dedicates a whole chapter to the Mosuo people of China.
Okay.
They practice something called walking marriage.
Walking marriage.
Yeah.
What is that?
So basically, women choose their partners freely, and men visit their lovers at night,
Hmm.
but they leave before dawn.
So there's no like
Yeah.
cohabitating or anything.
Exactly.
Wow. So they don't even have a word for marriage in their language.
No, not really.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's a very different system.
But what about the kids?
So children are raised primarily by their mothers and their extended families, and fathers play a big role in raising their sisters' children.
Their nieces and nephews.
Exactly.
So it's like this built-in support system where everyone chips in.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very communal approach to child rearing.
And jealousy is not really an issue.
Well, it seems to be much less of an issue in Mosuo culture.
Seriously.
Yeah, because there's not this expectation of exclusivity.
Hmm.
There's less pressure to control or possess a partner.
Wow. So they really challenge our assumptions about family and relationships.
Yeah, they really do.
Okay, so is Sex at Dawn basically saying that maybe like a lot of the problems we see in modern relationships come from trying to force this monogamy thing when it might not actually be natural for us?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the main arguments of the book.
Right.
They're not saying that monogamy is bad or that everyone should be non-monogamous,
Right.
but they're just encouraging us to question those assumptions, to be open to the possibility that there might be other ways of doing things.
So, like, to broaden our horizons a bit.
Exactly. And to recognize that there's a whole spectrum of human desires and experiences.
Okay, this is fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been talking a lot about social structures and cultural norms.
Yeah.
What about like the biological stuff?
Oh, yeah.
Does Sex at Dawn get into that at all?
Totally. They delve into the biology of sex, especially when it comes to the female orgasm.
Okay, now we're talking. The traditional narrative often portrays the female orgasm as this big evolutionary mystery.
Right.
Like, if it's not essential for reproduction, why did it even evolve?
Right, exactly. But Sex at Dawn suggests that the female orgasm might have played a really important social role in our evolutionary past.
So it's not just about pleasure.
Well, it's definitely about pleasure,
Okay.
but they're saying it might have served a purpose too.
Tell me more.
Okay, so imagine a woman having orgasms with multiple men within a social group.
Okay.
It creates this shared experience,
Yeah.
a sense of connection and intimacy
Mm-hmm.
that could potentially strengthen the bonds between those men.
Oh, I see. So it's like a natural social glue.
Exactly. It helps to create a more cohesive and cooperative group dynamic.
That's amazing. But wouldn't that also create like a ton of tension between the men involved?
It's possible. But remember, we're talking about a time period where sharing, including sexual partners, was potentially the norm.
Right.
So jealousy and possessiveness might not have been as big of a deal.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm rethinking everything I thought I knew about human sexuality.
that's what this book does.
But you mentioned sperm competition earlier. Can
Yeah.
you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So sperm competition happens when a woman has intercourse with multiple men within a short time frame.
Okay.
The sperm from each man are basically competing to fertilize the egg.
So it's like survival of the fittest at a microscopic level.
Exactly. It's a tiny little battle going on.
Okay, but if women are unconsciously choosing,
Yeah.
wouldn't evolution favor men whose sperm are like really good at this competition anyway?
That's a great question.
Eh.
And it leads to another fascinating point. Some researchers believe that female orgasms might actually influence which sperm have the best chance of winning this competition.
Wait, are you telling me that a woman's body might be subconsciously choosing the father of her child?
That's the theory. The contractions that happen during a female orgasm can actually help to draw sperm further into the reproductive tract,
Okay.
potentially giving some sperm an advantage.
So it's not just about pleasure. It could actually be about
Yeah.
giving women a way to influence which genes get passed down.
Exactly. It suggests a level of female agency in reproduction that we haven't really thought about much before.
Okay, so the female orgasm is like way more complex and multifaceted than we ever imagined.
It really is.
But what about men?
Yeah.
Does Sex at Dawn like challenge the assumption that men are just driven by this like constant need for sexual novelty?
Yeah, they do. They actually cite a study
Okay.
showing that women's brains might respond to a wider range of erotic stimuli than men's brains do.
Seriously?
Yeah.
So like that stereotype of men being the ones who are always thinking about sex might not actually be true.
It might be more nuanced than that.
Okay, so we're breaking down stereotypes left and right today.
We are.
If Sex at Dawn is right, and our modern society really is built on some like shaky assumptions about human sexuality,
Yeah.
what are the consequences?
Well, they argue that this disconnect between our evolved tendencies
Right.
and our current social norms might be at the root of a lot of problems we see in modern relationships.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, infidelity, divorce.
Mm-hmm.
The high rates of those things are often pointed to as evidence that the traditional monogamous model isn't working for everyone.
And it's not just like the obvious consequences like cheating and breaking up.
Right.
It's also like the emotional toll
Yeah.
of trying to live up to these unrealistic expectations.
Exactly, like feeling guilty or inadequate if your desires don't fit the mold.
This has been like seriously eye-opening.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm seeing so many things in a new light.
That's the power of challenging those assumptions, right?
Totally. But before we wrap up, I remember Sex at Dawn brought up this really interesting idea
Yeah.
that our fear of death might be linked to our anxieties about sex.
Yeah, that's a deep one.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
So basically, they suggest that our fear of death might be amplified by the fact that we've separated sex from its natural context
Okay.
within the cycle of life and death.
I'm intrigued, but I need a little more hand. What do you mean by natural context?
Okay, so think about it. In many indigenous cultures, sex is seen as a celebration of life,
Yeah.
a way of connecting to the natural world, to the ancestors.
It's like woven into their rituals and ceremonies
Exactly.
that acknowledge the connection between life and death.
Yeah.
But in our modern world, we kind
Yeah.
of try to avoid those connections.
Yeah.
Death is something to be feared and avoided,
Mm-hmm.
and sex is often treated as something completely separate from nature.
Right. And Sex at Dawn argues that this separation, this compartmentalization, might actually be feeding into our anxieties about both sex and death.
So by trying to control and sanitize these natural aspects of our existence,
Yeah.
we might actually be making them more frightening.
Potentially.
That's a pretty profound idea.
It is. They're suggesting that embracing a more holistic view of life,
Okay.
one that recognizes the interconnectedness of all things, including sex and death, might help us to live more fully and face our mortality with less fear.
Wow, that's a powerful message. It makes you wonder what else we've lost
Yeah.
in our quest for like control and order.
Mhm.
But I think we've covered a lot of ground here today.
We have. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah.
I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface of Sex at Dawn.
Yeah, so much to unpack.
But we've uncovered some really thought-provoking ideas.
Absolutely.
Like, if embracing a more holistic view of life is key,
Mm-hmm.
how do we even begin to bridge that gap? I mean, where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ryan and Jitha don't really give us like a step-by-step plan or anything, but they definitely encourage us to just keep questioning these assumptions we've inherited about sexuality and relationships.
So no easy answers?
Not really. It's more about like they're handing us a flashlight
Okay.
and saying, go explore.
I like that.
Yeah.
So maybe just asking the right questions is a good place to start.
Yeah, for sure.
If our ideas about sexuality are like so off base,
Mm-hmm.
what other societal norms could be built on shaky foundations?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Like, is everything up for debate now?
I mean, it's possible. This book really opens up a whole can of worms.
It does.
It makes you wonder how many of our social structures are based on, like, a really incomplete understanding of human nature.
Right. Like, if we just assume that humans are inherently selfish and competitive,
Yeah.
then we create systems that are designed to, like, control and restrict those impulses.
Right, exactly. It's all about control.
What if Sex at Dawn is right? What if cooperation and sharing are actually, like, deeply rooted in our evolutionary history?
That's a huge what if.
It is a huge what if.
Imagine how differently we might organize our societies. If we started from that premise.
We might be less focused on, like, individual success
Yeah,
and more invested in the well-being of the group.
totally. We might prioritize things like empathy and compassion.
Sharing resources.
Exactly.
It's a pretty amazing thought experiment.
It really is. It highlights how much our beliefs about human nature, like, really shape the world around us.
Yeah, and so much of our culture is built on these unspoken assumptions
Yeah,
about who we are and what we're capable of.
totally.
And a lot of times those assumptions really limit our potential.
They do. If we're constantly told that humans are greedy and self-serving,
Yeah.
it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It really does. This has been an incredibly eye-opening conversation.
It has.
I feel like I'm looking at everything differently now.
Yeah, that's the power of a book like Sex at Dawn. It challenges us to really re-examine our most fundamental beliefs about ourselves and the world.
It's definitely shaken things up for me.
Oh, good.
And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah,
Like, we need to be willing to question those deeply ingrained narratives.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Even if it makes us a little uncomfortable.
Even if it makes us uncomfortable. Sex at Dawn has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
And it's definitely sparked some important conversations.
Yeah, for sure.
And to our listeners out there,
Yeah.
we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas.
Keep questioning.
Dive into Sex at Dawn. Challenge your own assumptions.
Yeah.
And keep asking those tough questions.
Mm.
Because as we've learned today,
Mm.
sometimes the most profound insights come from questioning what we think we already know.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.